Hello, and welcome to The Connection. This podcast is about understanding and building the connection we have with others and with ourselves. I hope that through this podcast, you'll be able to have more joy and fulfillment in your life. I'm your host, Jared Hurst. This week on my podcast, I wanted to talk with you about a concept that recently came to my mind. So, one of my very favorite podcast episodes that I've ever heard is by Dr. Andrew Huberman. He's a professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at Stanford School of Medicine. And in this podcast episode, he is talking about grief. The reason I love this episode so much is I find that grief is one of the most difficult emotions. Maybe you might find it different, but for me, grief is an incredibly challenging emotion to work through. And if I were to simplify what Dr. Huberman says about grief, it is that grieving is learning to accept the difference between what is and what was. It's about learning to accept our reality. And I was thinking about that the other day, and I started looking at that in a different way. I flipped my perspective on it, and I said, well, if the way we work through grief is by accepting our reality, then any time there's a disconnect between our reality and what our mind is thinking, that would be a form of grief. I sat with that for a moment and said, do I actually believe this little theory that's popped into my head? And I realized that I have had times where I'm grieving within a relationship, within a friendship, or some type of platonic relationship, or some type of romantic relationship, because there's a disconnect between reality and my mind. Now, if you think back on your life, there's probably times where you've been in a relationship and you can see that there is a difference between the way that somebody is treating you and the way that you want them to treat you. Or there's a disconnect between the way that they're treating you now and the way that they used to treat you. And when they're continuing to treat you in a way, and your mind is continuing to act as though they're treating you the way that they used to, or continuing to act and treat them as though they are treating you the way that you wish that they would, I think your subconscious mind picks up on it, and we start to feel a form of grief. It's crazy to think that. To think that our mind is there trying to give us hints and say, look, this is not reality. You are not accepting reality. And so when I look at those times and the really painful emotions that I've felt, when things aren't going the way that I want and people aren't treating me the way that I want, how do I work through those difficult times and those emotions? How do you work through those difficult times and emotions where there is this dissonance between reality and what's going on up here? Well, there's three things that I think can really help you when you're struggling with that kind of a situation. One is acceptance. When you look at regular types of grief, when we have somebody that passes away or we have a romantic partner that leaves us, the way that we work through those moments is by learning to accept what is going on, letting go of that past relationship. Or in the case of a loved one, it's learning to love and appreciate the moments we have, but accept that they are gone. And it takes time for that to happen, for our mind to remap those relationships. But when you're in a relationship and all of a sudden somebody starts treating you differently than they did before, that's really challenging, because it's not this cut-off situation of somebody like a breakup or somebody dying, because they're still there. And if you're continuing to want them to treat you differently, then sometimes you might take action. With somebody like myself that is an anxious attachment style, you have been programmed to look for disconnect with in a relationship. You are looking for any sign that you are losing connection with that person, because somewhere in your childhood, somewhere in your past, you have learned that if I don't pay attention, I am going to lose connection. And so I need to manage that. And so what happens is somebody starts to pull away, and so you chase after them, trying to repair what's wrong. You try to fix things instead of accepting them as they are, and then continuing to control what you can control. So I think the first thing is to accept what's going on. Look at the situation and look at the way that somebody is treating you as a friend, as a romantic partner, and ask yourself, am I being honest with myself about the way things are right now? If you're feeling a lot of emotion around that relationship, there may be that disconnect where you're not looking at things clearly. I think the advice that we need to match the energy of people and we need to match the effort of people, I think that's a really good advice, because at that point we kind of correct that disconnect. We correct the difference between reality and the way that we are handling the situation. Now, with that said, I do think that there's room for us to make efforts that the other person isn't making, to put out bids for connection with that person. Because the thing is if you pull back, and then I pull back, and then you pull back, and then I pull back, and we just keep pulling back, then you end up just killing relationships because both people run away from the situation. So I do think that there's a power in learning to match the energy and the actions of the other people that we're interacting with, but continuing to try and build that relationship back up. Okay? So that's the first thing, is acceptance and matching. The second thing is faith. It's accepting that things may not ever change back to the way they were. Things may not ever become the way that we want them to be. That disconnect might always be there. That change in their behavior or the way that they relate to us may never be what we want. And accepting that if that happens, we are going to be okay. Having that belief in ourselves, having that belief in our future, I think faith adds a certain level of certainty to our life. And certainty creates safety. Whenever we are feeling safe, we are going to be more regulated in our emotions. Our nervous system is going to be much calmer. And when we're in a calm state, we're able to implement our logical brain. It's actually true that when we reach certain emotional states, our logical brain disconnects and we have difficulty using logic. So we have the answers to problems, but because we're so emotional, we can't access those things. So what do? We create faith. And as we have faith and belief in our future, and we build that, then we create certainty, safety, and the ability to process and deal with that and access those answers that are already inside of us. The last thing I would say that can help us with this situation is shifting our perspective and asking ourselves, is the reason that we're dealing with this reality, or is it a perception? You know, with somebody that is an anxious attachment style, a lot of the times, because we're so programmed to look for disconnect, we see disconnect where there is none. There is no disconnect. If you were to be able to look inside of the mind of the other person, you would see that they are just as connected to you as they always were. But because you are looking at tiny little things in their behavior, and then using that behavior and extrapolating that and deciding that those actions mean that there's been a disconnect, you start feeling all these intense grieving emotions. You start feeling anxiety. And the reality is, you don't need to feel that way. So start looking at your perception and asking yourself, is my perception reality, or is my perception being colored by my fears and my insecurities. I hope that as you look at your life, as you see those times when you have been grieving and struggling with friends or colleagues or romantic partners, and you have been hurting inside, that you can start to look at that and say, how can I work through this? How can I get myself in a better space by accepting what's going on, by treating myself the way that I need to be treated, by having faith and belief in myself and my future, and by shifting my perspective. I know you can do it. I believe in you. And until next week, remember that you are not alone.